Okay, trust me, it's not as bad as it looks. I see you typing away at the comments already. Trust me, yes, there are more than 2 decks in this format, okay? Okay. You with me now? Omniscient Awakening released in mid-December in English and early October in Japan. And I know what you're thinking. DF, you live in Japan. Why are you uploading this so late? Unfortunately, the end of the year period is really busy for me. I actually even had this beautiful thumbnail done by Hisashi ready like a month ago, but that's besides the point. I am here to answer your burning questions. Is Levidras actually the best deck? Is it actually Rezael? Why was Rezael so much more represented in Japan than it has been in English so far? What about Odium? DF, you used her all the time, right? Where does she rank at? Is Varga actually a fraud? It just won an international online tournament. Is there any secret hidden tech or some secret counter decks that can counter this entire meta? These questions will be answered today as we break down the top 10 best decks of the Divine's Set 5 format. We're gonna go with the usual format of counting down the top 10 best decks of this format, going through the Japanese data provided by VG Paradox first and foremost. But unlike these videos that I usually do, I will actually be including a little bit of repositioning in the list according to some of the early BCS results we've seen for this meta in the English side as well. With that, let's begin. In 10th, I'll answer the last question that I posed by showing you a deck that countered the top 2 best decks of this format, which is Prison. A player named Minky actually finished 10th in the Japanese Nationals with this exact list, as it's able to take advantage of the biggest weakness of the top 2 best decks, which is their resources. Spoiler alert, but both Rezael and Levidras always leave something in Soul, which is their original copies, and Levidras always needs counterblast for a lot of its cards. Seraph Purelight always rips out 2 cards from the opponent's hand, Field and Soul on ride, meaning that since both Rezael and Levidras slide in a grade 3 mid-battle, they don't have ways to empty Soul before the Prison player rides Purelight, unlike other decks. Levidras players have also cut their counterchargers for more copies of Squirrel, helping position Prison even better. The icing on the cake is the newest addition to the deck, Capture Sherino. Her first skill isn't anything spectacular, giving you just drop zone in Prison and 5k gain on attack, but the unique part of her is the second effect, being able to retire herself to choose an opponent's imprisoned card and send it to the bottom of the deck. This is huge because usually when a Prison player, rides their grade 2 and asks the opponent to give up something from hand into the Prison, usually that player will put something in the Prison that they want to call next turn. This way, if the opponent gives up something like a Sergaon or a Gabuelius, you can actually bot deck it so that they lack a critical piece for the rest of the game. That of course applies for later in the game as well, but do keep in mind that because of Seraph Purelight, if you reduce the number of cards in the Prison, it will affect her power and critical buff as well. This list is particularly interesting since it runs the 24-hour order to have even more hand disruption, so it really feels like it was built to counter this meta. In 9th, this is where I took a little bit of freedom to position a deck that didn't necessarily do that hot in Japan, but is definitely going to be a lot more of a trend in English, which is Eledglema. Commonly referred to as Bats, Batman, Batbat, etc. This deck even came up when Nak and I were discussing differences between the Japanese and English sides of the game on stream the other day, with Nak mentioning that oftentimes Japan likes to always stick to decks that are stable and have a lot of data about them to learn from, whereas English players tend to favor experimenting with more risky and high rolly decks that have much higher ceilings. Eledglema is exactly that, and the 2 cards I got in the set basically out of nowhere pulled it out of like obscurity into a real meta threat. In case you need a reminder of what this random promo boss unit does, on ride it checks the top 5 cards of your deck and throws all set orders that you find there into the order zone for free. After that, after he attacks, he lets you choose any number of different set orders in your order zone and return them to the deck, and if you return 3, he stands a rear guard, and if you return 5, he stands himself while losing 2 drives. This effect is not once per turn, so if you have 10 set orders, you theoretically can do this effect twice, giving you 3 Vanguard attacks in that one turn as well. What made this deck good is the addition of Moe Flash, a common grade 1 from this latest set that retires itself and effectively allows you to reveal any number of set orders from hand and set them, and then also gives you a card draw. This basically means that even if you whiff the top 5 from Eledglema, you can still basically set up your order zone for virtually free. What really took the deck to the next level is the double rare Jumbo Scrusher. He essentially counterblasts 1 and Energy Blast 3 when he attacks, as long as you have 3 or more different set orders in your order zone to draw one, get 10k, and if you have 5 or more different orders, he also gains an extra critical for that turn. That means that if you choose to target Jumbo as the restand target from Eledglema, that crit will stick around for each attack, and since it's not once per turn, you can actually keep using this effect as long as you fulfill the condition. As you can see, all of the set orders that are played in this deck either give you card draw or deck search or generate soul or give you like a Shadow Army token or something. And using the Archite ride line means that you can actually search the Torrential Energy research in order to search out both of these new cards because they're both monsters in their name. And so is Eledglema, by the way. The deck is somewhat high rolly and definitely does benefit a lot from going first, but as I've shown on the channel before, if it does and it gets all of its parts, it can really decimate any opponent before they even ride grade 3. There's a lot more that I can say about this deck, but at the time of making this video, it's important to note that this deck is also pretty cheap to build as well. I did hear that Savoard has been going up lately, but maybe if you're lucky, you can still snag the rest of the deck for a pretty good price. Going up to 8th though, I once again have to mention a discrepancy between Japanese and English. In Japan, both Shiranui and Shojodoji actually got hit with a restriction before this actual set came out, whereas in English they have not been hit yet, neither one of which. This did affect the presence of both decks, but Shiranui still sticks around at 8th and I actually saw a lot of strong finishes throughout the Japanese Nationals despite the restriction, so I hope this top 32 list is a good reference just in case the restrictions do still happen on the English side. In 7th, we have Shojodoji right next to it, as the answer many players found to Izasao being put to 1 is to add in other cards that can help generate resources and do things early game, such as Forktail or Ford and Reveltis. Shenrui's been working hard this format as well, being a common component in a lot of the top meta decks we'll see throughout this video. Before we move on to 6, I just want to say thank you for 60k subscribers. This year I'm changing up my approach to really try to gun for 100k and try to just like spread the word of Vanguard to the rest of the world. So if you enjoy the kind of content that I put out and you'd like to support the channel, please do check if you're subscribed or not, as subscribing honestly is like the easiest way that you can show support for the channel. Also, if you or someone you know is getting into Vanguard or competitive Vanguard, I would really appreciate if you show them this video because I do try to make sure that this is a good reference, including a lot of competitive deck lists. So I'd really appreciate that. And also, if you're interested, I make first-person perspective fights of almost all the decks featured in this video for YouTube channel members exclusively. So if you want to see how these decks function, consider becoming a YouTube channel member as well. With that, in 6th, we actually have, very fittingly, our first faded one of this list, and it is Blangmeire. Now I know, Blangmeire just got a new form announced. I very conveniently am filming this right after that announcement, but I'm sure you're thinking, Blangmeire didn't get any support in this set. How did it get all the way up to 6th? And you're right, there was no support for Blangmeire in set 5, but what it did get is a good positioning into a lot of the top decks. Against Levidras, you can effectively play lame and not give them much draw off of their markers until you fire your divine skill to turn off the skill entirely. Against Rezael, you've always been able to remove the divine skill for a turn as well. Against Odium, it's basically a race to who divines first wins, so while it is a pain to go second, going first is actually quite an uncomfortable matchup for the Odium player too. The other thing that I'm sure the Japanese version players are aware of is that we saw the release of a very good new generic promo that unfortunately has not been announced for English yet, which I would really like for it to be. Cough cough Bushiroad please. And that is Philia. This card is basically Shenri but for dark states, word for word, bar for bar. When she boosts, if your opponent has 1 or less rear guards or you played an order this turn, she gains 5k and can soul herself in after boosting to draw you a card. I'm really confused as to why Bushiroad International didn't just make her the sneak peek promo for this set. Like, you put out Sergaon so fast, why did Philia not come out this fast, right? It just seems kind of strange. You can see that not just this Ford and Reveltis version, but also this order-based version of Blangmeire is using it, since she makes 28k columns on turn 2 with Ford, or she can be called out of soul after using her effect by the order as well, and now also be an 18k booster. I'm sure she'll get announced for English sooner or later, so I hope that there's still value in me showing you these lists unless they release her together with the new Blangmeire, in which case that would be a little bit missing the mark. Anyway, sailing in at fifth, however, is none other than the pirate queen herself, Nightrose. In Japan, she actually released before set 5, and the list has definitely evolved a lot over time. Believe it or not, what you're looking at right now is actually what a standard Nightrose list looks like, by the way. If you're a Vanguard boomer like me, you probably know that Nightrose is a deck that's basically been known for running a bunch of 1-ofs and a bunch of techs, all of the situational 1 or 2-ofs that you could reliably search out until now. In standard, she doesn't exactly have that kind of like complete full deck toolboxing, but she still goes through the deck fast enough that you're able to see a lot of the cards you run as 1 or 2 of pretty consistently. The core pieces run at high copies are of course Nightrose herself and Large Golf, since not only does it draw when ditch for stride cost, but also when cold while striding, he allows you to get back any grade 2 or greater card from drop, including orders. Marauding Shade is a great attacker while also being a 15k shield. Bone is the second best grade 1 in the deck, being able to retire himself to draw you a card after boosting if he was revived from drop this turn. And the best grade 1 that you always run as a 4-of is Alvina. Not only a 10k body, but also Energy Blast 3 on call to revive any grade 1, such as Bone, or get any non-Regulus order from drop to hand. Thanks to that, we can play Ghost Chase to bounce Alvina and keep getting it back to hand, Flower Shop to revive perfect guards and intercept with them against guard restrict decks, and other lists also run cards like Nectar. In this other build by Bear, a famous player from Hong Kong, you can see the inclusion of Seed Machine Gun to counter multi-attacking matchups, along with Espronia to give the deck more turn 2 options outside of just Alvina. What's really cool is that with the English confirmation of the Korokoro set coming out, a lot of the cards that are run in this deck will actually be reprinted in English too. And Large Golf has a reprint in set 6, Philander has a reprint in Korokoro, and a lot of the other cards either come from the deck set or were already pretty easy to get, maybe with the exception of like Alvina and I guess Asproni if you do choose to run her. I'll go more into depth on Nightrose in a different video, but honestly she's really well matched into this meta in my opinion. So if you're a Nightrose fan, or if you're like me and you were a very broke college student that couldn't afford to build Nightrose in G even though you really wanted to, at least you can enjoy Peak once more in standard. I also just recommend picking up Nightrose as well, just because even just the Stride deck set on its own is already quite good, and just the reprint of Enlarge Golf already basically like gave you back the most core piece that you would have needed. And before we jump into the top 4, it's time to take a look at the honorable mentions. Since we just went over Nightrose, I'd like to shine the spotlight on the other Rummy Labyrinth member, Hari. While Hari did get good results here and there, the deck took a while to get solved, and even then I wouldn't really say it's solved, but as you can probably tell from this list that came first at the Yamagata Deluxe, it is pretty teched out. The deck has the usual good crest scaling and multi-attacks, but the lack of early game is the biggest difference maker between Hari and Rose. The good part is that you have access to Lukir's Pale Moon and counter support, such as Showered Applause Dragon as a good attacker and soul generator, and Tug as a good way to search out your pieces. The next mention also comes in a pair, which is Love and Berry. While we don't know when these will come to English yet, both of these collab decks were really good in the Japanese format, and if I were to include Love in the statistics, she would have easily ranked top 5 in this chart as well. I've shown the deck in a different video, but it's basically a Majesty Lord Blaster with 18k base power that deck thins constantly, does 5 attacks by restanding 2 rears, and constantly checks the top cards of the deck. What it does is simple but really strong. Berry, on the other hand, won the Japanese Nationals, which I also have an archive of on this channel, and essentially hits hard and fast with a Vanguard that re-rides into the grade 2 form after attacking once, giving you 4 attacks that all pack a punch and some draw power. Again, if these do come out in English, I honestly expect them to do pretty well, even if they come out in a later set. Next is a deck that my team found a lot of success with, which is Eledglema. This is the exact list that me and my teammate Choroshka landed on for the Yamagata Deluxe and finished in top 16 with, choosing to not only play the strongest overcharge units and have an easier time to draw into them with 7 draw cyclers, and Kargaplan I guess also offering retire to the deck, which it doesn't otherwise have. The addition of more deck thin is also really appreciated in this set, and I'd say it has a pretty good matchup into Levidras, so if your meta is infested with it, I highly recommend this list. And finally, my tournament pick before Odium came out, which of course was Leonore. Pretty fitting because of the master deck set announcement, huh? This list finished top 16 in the Deluxe Nationals in Japan, choosing to abandon Broccoli in favor of Gun Cyclers and Parseia as another way to regenerate boards, especially in case your Rosariums get wiped out. This version of the deck should be less aggressive than the old version in theory, so Leonore herself seems to have shifted for a more mid-range game plan now. And thus, we return to the ranking, and I'm sure you're wondering by now, in what order will the 4 units in the thumbnail end up ranking? Fittingly enough, the 4th place goes to the only unit in that thumbnail that can only realistically physically appear on turn 4, which is Varga Rasets. Or Rakshasa, I guess, but Raset sounds cooler. Varga has been a common placer in these top 10 lists ever since its inception, and honestly, Rasetsu is an addition that will definitely help retain its high positioning going forward. Not only does it activate Persona Ride when you ride it over the original Varga, but also gone is the requirement to worry about how much damage your opponent is at for its divine skill, as it'll now go off as long as you swung twice using its first skill. They buffed the Retire too. It now not only wipes the front row of both players on attack, but also the back row after you're done attacking, which did filter out some of the strong decks of the past meta like Leonorn down a few ranks. So you might be thinking, why is it not ranked in the top 3? Well, the only real support card it got was Storm Slasher Dragon, basically a 13k body while you're in the Malworm state, and otherwise when he's retired he calls himself to the back row in rest state, but if you're in Malworm state you can Soulblast 1 to stand him instead. So because of that, there's been quite a lot of difference in builds. This one you've been seeing is what I'd call relatively template. This one on the other hand is a lot more teched out, running the order package and a whole variety of techs. In this deck you can use Justina to search out the Dragobond order, then use Shura to target the Justina before she's retired by Rasets to go back to hand, and then do that effect all over again next turn. Same goes for Twin Pulsive, by the way. If he finds a PG off the top 5, you can actually just add it to hand with Shura when it would get retired by Rasets. The list I personally gravitated to the most was this one that got top 32 in the Deluxe Nationals, running Shenri instead of Impale Horn, since you can resolve a Shenri boosting your Vanguard before you retire your back row. Overall, Rasets definitely did add a lot to the deck, but in my opinion didn't really patch up the big issues that Varga has had until now, one of which is of course the triggers. Right? Any triggers that you check during the first Varga swing will greatly impact the rest of the swings and how your opponent guards. So getting unlucky in that instance is already going to kind of like turn down the deck's power quite a bit, and you usually compensate that with a strong early game with, you know, so Storm Slasher that is quite easy to do, but even then there was always going to be a pretty big difference between whether you go first or second with Varga, and that's why it ended up in 4th. However, speaking of decks with massive power going first, I think it's time that we rank our 3rd best performing deck of this format, and it is of course none other than the deck that I personally used to get top 16 in the Yamagata Deluxe, which is Liel Odium. I've been actually working on a huge feature on the Destined One of Time, including my run with the deck throughout the WGB season in the late 2024. And just as a little early preview snippet, let me show you just a little bit of the thumbnail that I had designed for that video too. But that's all you're getting. You're gonna have to subscribe to make sure you're notified for when that video drops. Now then, what does Odium do that brings her all the way up to 3rd? Simply put, she has a mechanic that we TCG YouTubers love to farm views with, called Extra Turn. The grade 1 of the ride line gives you this Regress Gauge token, which you fill up with cards as the game goes on. The grade 2 of the ride line puts a card in there on ride to draw 2. Then, Odium herself puts either a card from hand or a rear in there to gain triple drive. Her personal order, Distorted Bane, also goes to Gauge when played to draw you a card with an optional Soul Charge 1, and gives 10k to your Vanguard, which leads to Odium's effect buffing your front row rears by 5k for each Bane in your Gauge. Then, once you have 5 cards in your Gauge after Odium attacks, you can discard 2 cards from hand to gain that additional turn, except you don't get a ride or a main phase, meaning you still draw for turn, but don't get the energy nor the chance to call any new rears from hand or Persona Ride. This is resolved by Anachronous Dragon, who pops out of Gauge for a Counterblast 1 and putting a card from drop into Gauge, so even if you send him to Gauge by Odium's effect, he will still pop out to attack. He also gains 5k on his own and can retire your opponent's rears, so even though this is a 3 attack deck, you get a good control over resources. The cool thing is that the general package of Odium, generally speaking, ends there. The other staple is basically Rester, and I mean that's just basically an additional 4 copies of your Distorted Bane order. The build you're seeing now is the one I got top 16 with in the Yamagata Deluxe. And back then I was using previously mentioned Philia for early game presence, together with Leymina to help draw cards early and pop Philia out of Soul on Persona turns, paired with Vasago, who would return my ride line cards cards back to help search for any copies of Distorted Bane or Anachronous Dragon that I was missing. The other card that you often see is Almanac Colossus, a 10k attacker or booster once you've got 3 gauges, that also draws you a card and soul charges 1 when you call it for 1 counterblast. Early on I really liked this card because it gave you a bunch of resources and made good numbers with both Anachronous and Odium, but the soul charge can really bring you close to deck out if you don't win the game by turn 5. However, the list I was testing more recently, before set 6 came out, looked more similar to this one, going for 8 cyclers with Tiskar so that I'm constantly drawing cards and having an easier time discarding engaging stuff, and Orions to help filter the deck before we start triple driving. This list came 19th at the Japanese Nationals, basically replacing Orions for Colossus that we mentioned earlier. Now I'm sure what you're thinking, DF, we don't have Philia in English. Is this deck useless? Is all hope lost without her? And I'm glad to tell you that that is absolutely not the case. Even in Japan, this list came 23rd at Nationals, running Gungunram instead, and generally speaking being a lot more tacked out for early game aggression. In Indonesia, in the Japanese format WGP, this Philia-less list came 3rd, choosing to run Amidutana instead to distribute 5k buffs when called or gauged, making it a good aggressive piece as well. Derek Dow picked this list up and improved on it in the English format, which is one that I'd personally recommend as well. Philia is definitely an incredible card to have, but even I did consider taking her out at times since she's really easy to counterplay. Especially Rezael can just like call 2 rears early and now you just have a vanilla. If Rezael is popular in your locals, I'd even consider reducing Philia copies even if you do play the Japanese format. Anyway, enough rambling. Odium is a deck that I really love myself, and I just wanted to show you a bunch of different lists while I work on the big feature for her, and she also got new support which I already started rambling about on my Twitter, so make sure you check that out, link in description. So I hope with all of that you are at least satisfied for the Odium content for now. That being said, will this video come to a satisfying end for you though? It's no spoiler at this point, Levidras and Rezael are the 2 best decks, but which one did I put over the other? If we're going by online discourse and the graphic I showed you at the beginning of the video, surely it is Rezael in 2nd, right? Actually, the data says otherwise. While it is very close, Rezael actually performed a good percentage better than Levidras in Japan, even though it was neck and neck. And that is why Levidras is the one to come in 2nd, and personally I do feel that it does have more holes in his strategy compared to Rezael's grindy consistency, and the most recent BCS results of 2025 have actually reflected that as well. Unlike Odium, I only have 1 Levidras list to show because almost all lists have basically come to be this now. At first, Squirrel was played less than we had the countercharger, but this split has basically become the de facto, which I personally do think could still be developed upon with more early game options, which is still one of Levidras's current weaknesses. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Levidras because I already made a whole video about it, which I 100% recommend you watch, but basically it's an incredibly grindy deck once it gets to grade 3, with its sole weakness being its mulligan being very strict and piece reliant and its lack of early game pieces. Imperio makes 3 markers which either buff your units or draw you cards while giving minus 10k power to your opponent's rears, which then turns on all of your effects like an Octoguster to find pieces and stack triggers, Shamnet to revive herself and be a strong attacker that draws you cards, Foxhill that gives back row attack and power buffs to your units, and of course the aforementioned Squirrel that is basically a multi-use booster that you can throw all your triggers onto and will go on to commit crimes in your stead. Again, I highly recommend watching the Levidras video if you haven't seen it already for a more in-depth discussion, and we got another piece of Levidras support shown since that video was posted, so I'm sure we'll still be featuring Levidras in future videos too. And finally, the king that deserves the crown the most, Rezael Vita. One of the most low-key upgrades that ended up mattering the most, Vita brought this deck to the top, paired together with everyone's favorite banana-eating dragon, Gabuelius. Funnily enough, Rezael actually got the same amount of new cards as Varga, which is just these 2. However, the difference in quality is absolutely crazy. I'll explain what makes Rezael so good while we look at this build which trended particularly on release of the set. Vita does everything original Rezael did, just a bit better. He also, on attack, counterblast 1 to call 2 rears from drop that add up to your cards in damage, but much like a paid DLC patch, they added a new line to this effect that allows you to soul in a Rezael named card from hand to call an additional card from drop, and then all of your rears called by this entire effect will receive a 5k buff as long as your opponent's on grade 3 or greater. This additional call-in 5k gain is really significant, because until now, if your opponent didn't want you calling out certain cards, they just lock you at certain damage to make you choose what you call. But now it's like, oh, you let me at 2? Well, okay, I'll just call a grade 2 and a 0 and then slide in this Rezael to just call a grade 3 anyway. The 5k gain is also big because Rezael already had quite a bit of power gain on units like Sergaon, Tithfault, and Nilberis, but now not just units but entire columns getting 5k or 10k buffs in total means you're driving out a lot more cards from your opponent's hand faster too. It's simple but really effective. Much like Levidras, the king also inherits the original Rezael's divine skill and gains 5k for each copy of it in your soul, meaning that the small Vanguard columns issue that the deck had in the past is gone as well. What sets them apart is that Levidras slides in the original during the main phase, which allows you to immediately use the divine skill, but Rezael only does it in battle phase, meaning that if you put Vita in your ride line like Levidras does, you won't actually be able to use the divine skill until turn 4. This is why the majority of Rezael lists play the original one in the ride deck and then find the Vita to ride by turn 4, also because the 5k buff from Vita doesn't work going first on turn 3 either. To find Vita, many lists are running Cadwalla, since you have not just Vita and original Rezael as grade 3 targets on top of your grade 2 card pool, but also Gabuelius to add to hand from that effect too. Gabuelius is one of the best cards in the deck in my opinion, bringing back that feeling of healing out of an end of battle limit break with Spectral Duke Dragon. Sorry, this probably sounds like gibberish to new players, but for us Vanguard boomers, these words surely resonate. Gabuelius is straightforward. You call him, he Soul Blast 1 to check the top card of your deck, which you can leave on top or bottom. If you chose bottom, aka if it's not a trigger or something you want in hand, he's gonna get plus 5k. Then when he attacks, he will also gain plus 5k if you have 4 more damage, and if he was called by a fated one, such as Rezael or Lia Lamorta, he lets you counterblast 1 to get another 10k and do a single drive check. This basically means that on the divine turn, you're doing 4 drive checks total on a deck that's pretty compressed with a bunch of criticals, so the synergy with Rezael is absolutely amazing. Where the Rezael builds fork off is the choice of support units, and the list that you're seeing right now made use of Peradam as a way to build boards early while not losing cards from hand. And we saw Valtrosa's inclusion as a way to help dig for Sergaon early too. The build then evolved to include the original Olden Ride Line's grade 1, Tranquilia, as a way to find Sergaon as fast as possible. And this build that came second at Japanese Nationals also used a Tithfault Wisdom package to have early draw and a 20 to 30k solo attacker to add a bit more aggression back to the deck. My personal favorite build is Zidiku's, who came third at Nationals, just barely securing his World's Invite. This one leans into Valtrosa as a 4-of to make sure you see Sergaon early no matter what, and even if you don't, you still have good targets like grade 1 Maple that'll come back every time you ride Vita as a 13k booster or a 23k attacker, and also includes the cheeky one of Intercept set order in case you need to revive PGs from Rezael's skill in guard restrict matchups. The really immovable ratios, generally speaking, are the Rezaels, the 2 Gabuelius, the Nilberis, the Sergaon, and typically 2 Aerial Sages, but as you can see, a lot of the other cards definitely do change in ratio between these lists. Rezael's biggest strength is its consistency, and I think this build brings that about the most, making it so that its weakness is basically your opponent passing on turn 1 going second to not give you the 1 counterblast for whatever turn 2 play you had prepared, whether that's Peradam or Valtrosa or the Wisdom Order. I think this consistency and scaling is what puts it over Levidras for me personally. While Levidras does have a higher ceiling, I think this balance of the floor and ceiling just make Rezael a deck that I would personally also not just bring to tournaments myself, but also easily recommend to people getting into competitive play. And with that, that concludes this long overdue meta discussion video. I hope despite how late it was, this top 10 was still useful to you and you learned something new. If you want to learn more about this current meta, make sure you check out this Levidras video that I made that I'm really proud of. And if you're looking for tournament gameplay from this meta, then look no further than this channel. I have the entire archive of the Japanese Nationals that I restreamed that you can definitely check out for lots of high quality games. But with that, thanks for watching.